It was barely 7:00 a.m. when Laura Vincent pulled into the municipal lot just outside the east boundary of Eldridge Hollow, a quiet residential grid of winding streets, clipped hedges, and homes too tidy for their own good. In theory, it was one of the safer areas in her assigned district, the kind of neighborhood where people smiled while complaining and prided themselves on filing official forms instead of raising their voices. In practice, it was a bureaucratic minefield, precisely because those same people knew how to file complaints, how to demand hearings, and how to escalate minor disputes into paper storms that ate entire weeks of city time. Laura knew it all too well. She wasn't law enforcement, wasn't code enforcement either. She existed in the purgatory between municipal administrative oversight. When residents weren't satisfied with the local cops, or when a complaint required delicate community reconciliation, the city sent someone like her. She was used to verbal abuse disguised as neighborly suggestions, used to scanning yards for violations, fake survey markers, or disputed fences while residents loomed from porches with coffee and attitude. She had been called in after a series of obscure, contradicting complaints had piled up from one block in Eldridge Hollow. Officially, it was categorized under territorial boundary concerns, but in truth, it smelled like one person stirring the pot. The language was too uniform across the different reports. Phrases like civic integrity violation and unauthorized presence showed up in nearly identical wording in 6 separate submissions over 2 weeks, all from properties on the same cul-de-sac. It was a classic pattern, someone trying to leverage policy to police their neighbors. Laura parked a discreet city-issued sedan a block away from the epicenter, standard procedure when the situation might escalate, and began walking through the neighborhood with a clipboard tucked under her arm and a soft expression that said, "I'm just here to understand." Her eyes scanned the street for anything out of place. The lawns were surgical, the driveways empty, the sidewalks free of litter. If there had been a conflict here, it had left no visible scar. But halfway down the street, she noticed a cluster of bright orange cones cordoning off what appeared to be public curbside space, right near the corner lot. A hand-painted wooden sign stuck into the grass read, "Resident access only. No standing, no idling, no loitering." It had been nailed into the ground at an angle that suggested permanence. There were no official city markers nearby, and Laura was certain the curb was public access. There had been no documentation of recent zoning changes. She paused and noted the detail, snapping a photo for the record. It was a small infraction, the sort that wouldn't warrant a citation by itself, but it was usually the tip of the iceberg when a resident started treating public space like private turf. Just then, the front door of the corner house creaked open. A woman stepped out in an ankle-length quilted robe and orthopedic slip-ons, her hair pulled tightly into a bun that looked like it hadn't moved since the 1980s. She looked like the kind of person who vacuumed her mailbox. Laura knew her before she even introduced herself. "Excuse me, may I help you?" the woman called out in a tone that was not a question. "Morning," Laura said, offering a non-threatening smile. "Just doing a routine assessment. I'm with municipal administration." The woman didn't move from her porch. "You mean code enforcement?" "No, ma'am. Administrative oversight. A step adjacent. We assist when there's a pattern of unresolved boundary concerns or repetitive filings. It's a courtesy visit." The woman scoffed. "Nothing here needs oversight. That's the problem. No one's been overseeing anything." "Would your name happen to be Karen Melrose?" "It is," she said, lifting her chin like it was a credential. Laura nodded. "Thank you. I'll be reviewing all reports submitted in the last 60 days. If you'd prefer, I can leave a summary letter and we can follow up next week." Karen stepped off the porch. "No need. I'll give you the rundown now. It's the pickup truck that's always parked too close to the hydrant. The teenagers who ride those stupid scooters after curfew, and that sedan that's been left on the curb for days. No tags, no permits. It's inviting crime. This neighborhood used to have standards. Laura glanced at the curb. I didn't see a sedan. Well, not now, obviously. Someone must have tipped them off. But I have photos. Time-stamped. Karen was already reaching for her phone when another vehicle appeared at the far end of the street. It was a city-marked sheriff's truck, light bar mounted cleanly on top, plates clearly visible. Laura recognized it immediately. Garrett Sloane's rig. He had agreed to meet her on site in case they needed to mediate resident conflict. As far as she knew, Garrett wasn't the type to escalate anything. He was precise, controlled, and had 22 years on the force, most of it spent dealing with situations far tenser than a suburban cul-de-sac. Laura waved as he turned the corner and parked alongside the empty curb near the intersection, far from the cones. Garrett got out, greeted Laura with a brief nod, and turned to Karen. "Morning, ma'am. Just here to observe." Karen squinted. "That's your truck?" "Yes." "You can't leave it there." Garrett blinked. "It's a legal zone. There's no signage or restriction." Karen bristled. "It's obstructing visibility for people turning out of the drive. And I happen to know this section is under residential control." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "Residential control of a city street?" Karen stepped forward. "We had a petition. It's an informal designation. Safety-based." "Ma'am, no such designation exists in municipal code. The only thing informal here is the way that sign is nailed into public property." Karen's smile flattened. "I'll be reporting this." Garrett didn't respond. He turned to Laura. "I'll walk the perimeter. You need anything?" "Not yet," she said, eyeing Karen, who stood rigid with offense. 15 minutes passed. Garrett returned from his walk, spoke quietly with Laura, and agreed to swing back in an hour for further coordination. He stepped back into the truck, paused for a moment to look at something on the in-dash console, then stepped out again to respond to a message on his radio. It was routine. Quiet morning, no active alerts, a logistical issue with a courthouse delivery. When he returned, the truck was gone. At first, Garrett froze. The street was empty. No sound of an engine pulling away, no squeal of tires. Just the quiet, perfect stillness of a neighborhood that hated being disturbed. He scanned the road, jaw tightening, and walked to where the truck had been parked. Laura, still reviewing her clipboard, looked up. "Where's your vehicle?" "I don't know," Garrett said flatly. "It was right here." Karen's screen door creaked again. She stood behind it, sipping from a mug. "You can't just park anywhere and walk off. I called for removal." "You called? Who?" "A towing service. You left it unattended, and it was obstructing a residential buffer zone. I have every right." Garrett didn't speak. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "Oh." "That was a marked law enforcement vehicle registered to the city. You authorized a private company to remove it?" Karen smiled, thin and satisfied. "I don't recognize anyone's authority if they violate our safety ordinances." Laura turned to Garrett. "I'll escalate this to municipal logistics. You want me to file the obstruction report?" He nodded once, clipped. Then he stepped away, pulling his phone out and making a single call. Karen stood motionless, unaware that she had just made an irreversible mistake, not by defying a sheriff, but by moving a government vehicle off a public right-of-way under a false pretense. And in Eldridge Hollow, where everything looked clean on the surface, that kind of violation had a way of peeling back layers no one wanted seen. The following morning began not with the usual rhythm of administrative check-ins and quiet correspondence, but with an unusually terse summons to Laura's desk from the city transportation coordinator, Shelley Graham. Laura hadn't had her coffee yet when Shelley, a woman not known for emotional language, simply said, "We've got a problem. Your name's in the report." The report in question was an incident file marked Priority Internal Review, and the subject was the unauthorized towing of a municipal vehicle during active duty hours. The vehicle was Garrett Sloan's department-assigned sheriff's truck. What stunned Laura wasn't the report itself. It was how far it had already moved. A preliminary notice had been filed by Garrett's station captain, followed within hours by a confirmation of the vehicle's recovery from a private impound lot in a neighboring county. The file included photos, receipts, and a statement from the tow truck driver, who had left the city as soon as he was paid, citing increased community hostility. Someone had gone out of their way to redirect a police vehicle off city property, process it through a private channel, and place it where official retrieval would take time and red tape to untangle. Laura read through the documents twice. The name on the service request was Karen Melrose. The tow order cited abandoned government vehicle parked in a civilian hazard zone. No permit numbers. No agency signature, but the driver had been handed a printed form, pre-filled with an official-looking seal that City Legal had already confirmed was fake. What concerned Laura wasn't just the forgery. It was the fact that someone like Karen had the presence of mind and access to prepare it. This wasn't an act of impulse. It was planned, coordinated, executed with a paper trail just slim enough to feign legitimacy. She'd known Karen was meddling, but this bordered on procedural sabotage. As she left the office and headed back to Eldridge Hollow, her thoughts were not on citations or resident hearings anymore. They were on containment, on precedent. If someone like Karen could remove a law enforcement vehicle and delay its retrieval using third-party vendors, what else could she access? What else had she already done? When Laura arrived back on the block, it was just after 11 a.m., and she didn't bother parking discreetly this time. She wanted Karen to see her coming. The air was too still, the houses watching her with their eyes closed. She walked directly to the corner lot and rang the bell. Karen opened the door without surprise, still in her robe, her expression serene in the way that only someone utterly convinced of their righteousness can manage. "Back so soon," she said, as if greeting a guest returning too early from an errand. "I need to speak with you about the tow order," Laura said. Karen tilted her head. "I documented the obstruction. I followed the model ordinance for emergency removal of abandoned vehicles." Laura kept her voice even. "You issued a forged removal order under a fake seal and submitted it to a vendor not registered with the city. That vehicle was under active jurisdiction. That's not just improper, it's unlawful." Karen didn't flinch. "The form came from a resident guidance packet I received years ago. If you're saying it's out of date, that's hardly my fault. You presented it as current. You signed it as an enforcement liaison." "Well, someone had to. No one else was doing anything." Laura resisted the urge to step closer. "I'm going to ask you this once, directly. Did you initiate the tow yourself? Did you place the call?" Karen's eyes narrowed, but her tone didn't waver. "I coordinated a concern through a Civic Solutions contact. I didn't touch a phone." "Who was your contact?" Karen's pause was brief. "It's not my responsibility to vet vendors. I don't run background checks." "You do when you draft paperwork. You've crossed a line." Karen smiled without teeth. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning, and it's not for me." She turned and walked away, knowing full well that Garrett had already opened a formal inquiry. By the time she returned to her car, her phone was buzzing. Garrett, direct line. She answered on the second ring. "They processed the form through a recycled paper trail," he said without preamble. "Someone reactivated a decommissioned internal routing number. We're talking about more than just a nosy neighbor. She had help." "Internal?" "Possibly. There's no way she accessed that form without someone leaking archived material." "My station's combing communications logs now. Someone sent that document over city email 2 months ago. Unsigned, tagged as reference. We're trying to trace it." Laura exhaled, gripping the wheel. This isn't community friction. This is targeted manipulation of municipal process. It gets worse. That tow vendor. Their address is a closed lot in Newport. They're not on our books, but they've processed 3 vehicles in the last 6 weeks under similar justifications. Unauthorized curb use, safety buffer enforcement, perimeter hazard. Same form, same language. 2 of the other reports came from this block. Laura's hands clenched. You're telling me she's building her own shadow enforcement operation? I'm telling you someone is using her as a face and she doesn't know how deep in she is. The call ended, and Laura didn't move for a long time. She stared through the windshield at the trimmed lawns and the silence, at the street that had pretended to be a normal neighborhood until it wasn't. Karen wasn't just a busybody, she was a proxy, and someone was using her behavior, her obsessive civic devotion, to inject unauthorized control into city-managed space. The next day, Garrett initiated the first step in formal escalation. He submitted a criminal complaint under municipal interference statutes, citing the unauthorized manipulation of law enforcement property and falsification of city documents. Laura, meanwhile, filed a parallel administrative review, requesting a red tag designation on the corner lot that would place Karen's property under temporary observation for procedural violations. It wouldn't be public, but it would allow the city to flag any service requests, complaints, or utility access modifications originating from the address. It was a small net, but it might catch something. What neither of them expected was how quickly Karen responded. By noon, City Hall had received an official complaint from Karen Melrose, citing harassment, defamation, and administrative misconduct. The language was theatrical, but the effect was real. It triggered an internal pause on all direct actions until a review could be completed. Karen had essentially frozen her own investigation using the very mechanisms intended to protect citizens from overreach. Laura was furious, but not surprised. Garrett, however, was quieter than usual when they reconvened at the district station. "She's not doing this alone," he said finally. "She's executing someone else's playbook. We need to figure out who." They wouldn't have to wait long. That evening, Laura's email received an anonymous attachment. A photo of her city ID badge taken from behind as she stood at the Karen's curb. The caption was one sentence. "Are you here for the truth or the story?" Someone was watching them, not just the neighborhood, someone inside it, and Karen had just become the least of their problems. By the end of the week, the administrative pressure surrounding the situation had ballooned to the point where even uninvolved departments were feeling its heat. Internal memos circulated with veiled language, suggesting a need for procedural restraint in civilian disputes involving non-critical infrastructure. A diplomatic way of saying, "Don't touch this until the lawyers figure it out." Laura wasn't surprised when her supervisor pulled her aside under the pretense of a scheduling review and handed her a thin folder with no return label. Inside were 2 printed emails and a notice from Municipal Risk Management. Karen Melrose had escalated her harassment complaint to the city's liability division, claiming both Laura and Garrett had exerted undue pressure and acted outside the bounds of civilian oversight, whatever that meant. The language was clearly drafted by someone with legal training. Karen's past filings, for all their aggression, had always been erratic and overburdened with pseudo-legal jargon. This was different. Sharp, calculated, and written with the intent to paralyze. Laura read through the paperwork in silence while her supervisor watched with visible discomfort. At the end, he cleared his throat and told her that, for transparency, she would be temporarily reassigned to routine inspections in another sector until the review board concluded their findings. She wasn't suspended, but she was benched, and they both knew it. Garrett didn't fare any better. His commanding officer informed him that he would be pulled from neighborhood patrol duties pending the outcome of a procedural audit. The move wasn't disciplinary, but the implication was clear. Optics had to be preserved. In a town where appearances meant political currency, even the suggestion of departmental misconduct was treated like a bomb threat. Garrett took the reassignment without protest. He was too experienced to argue, but Laura could see the restraint in his posture when they met for coffee the next morning at a diner outside district lines. The place was nearly empty, just linoleum, old jazz playing low over the speakers, and a waitress who knew better than to interrupt. They sat without speaking for nearly 10 minutes, the silence between them filled with the gravity of understanding. When Garrett finally spoke, his voice was flat and measured. "She's not acting alone," he said, tapping a napkin against his coffee mug. "Someone fed her that complaint. She didn't write it." "I know. It read like it was meant for internal consumption. Precise, clinical. And she's not precise. I ran a check on the towing company again. The listed number connects to a shell line that reroutes through a VoIP hub in Vermont. But when I dug deeper, one of the payment processors for the company's transactions linked to a corporate name I recognized, Tevrin Solutions." Laura frowned. "That's the same group that bid for the traffic signal contract last year, right? Got denied after background checks?" "Yep. Disqualified for irregular bookkeeping and subcontractor opacity. Their filings are a mess, no clear ownership. But they had contacts all over city departments. They were trying to edge into minor enforcement domains, parking violations, street sweeping notices, even property line disputes. And they weren't subtle about it." Laura exhaled slowly. "You think they're testing backdoor enforcement models using residents like Karen? I think they're using her obsession as cover. She files the complaints, generates the paper trail, and they do the rest behind her back. Or with her approval, under the illusion she's doing civic good." The waitress brought more coffee without asking. Garrett nodded politely, then leaned forward. "There's more. A source inside logistics told me a new maintenance permit came through yesterday for Melrose's block, supposedly for underground utility inspection. Standard stuff. But the paperwork originated from a contractor we've never used, with no verified licensing. The work order was brief, something about soil density and drainage flow. But it didn't come from Public Works. It came from emergency planning." Laura's jaw tightened. "That department doesn't oversee residential soil assessments." "Exactly. And it turns out the permit was signed off digitally by a staffer who left the city 6 months ago. So now we have forged removal orders, hijacked permits, and a resident who either doesn't know she's being used or doesn't care." Garrett leaned back. And a department or two that's either looking the other way or in on it." Laura didn't respond. She stared past Garrett, out the diner window at the lot across the street. Empty, except for a blue trash can tipped sideways and a broken sign advertising window tinting services. Something about the silence outside made everything feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Finally, she spoke. "We can't do anything directly. Not with these reassignment orders. We'll trip internal alarms." "No," Garrett agreed, "but we can document. Quietly, through personal records. If it escalates, we can build a chain. No field work. Just paper." "Agreed." They parted with no more than a nod, a silent pact forged not in rebellion but in the knowledge that systems only moved when pressed the right way. And from the inside. Over the next several days, Laura kept her head down. She conducted routine housing compliance reviews in a sleepy suburban sector on the other end of the city. She checked smoke detector batteries, inspected handrail placements, and pretended not to read the side emails Garrett sent her. Lists of names, addresses, and the occasional vendor invoice with minor details circled in red. Meanwhile, Garrett quietly updated an offline log with dates and times of every known service entry linked to Karen Melrose's block. He cross-referenced vehicle plate numbers with contract workers and found that several of the same license plates showed up not just on her street, but at 3 other properties that had recently filed similar boundary conflict claims. The pattern was unmistakable. One evening, just before sunset, Laura drove past Karen's neighborhood, not to stop, but to observe. She stayed in her car, engine idling, and watched the corner lot through the reflection of a shop window across the street. The yard was too clean, the sidewalk too empty. But then she noticed a small detail that sent her stomach sinking. A man stood at the far end of the property line, half hidden behind a low hedge. He wore a reflective vest, no visible ID, and held a clipboard. But he wasn't checking anything. He was watching. Not working. Watching. Laura stayed in her car. She didn't confront him. Didn't make a scene. She took a photo, noted the time, and left. The next day, Garrett called. She requested another tow. Laura nearly laughed. For what? For a news van. They were trying to get footage of a separate zoning dispute down the block. She claimed it was surveillance equipment and filed a threat notice. Same vendor tried to show up. This time they were blocked by Public Works. Because of your flag. Because of a clerical conflict. Turns out your red tagging request hit someone's inbox at the right time. They paused, and for the first time in weeks, Laura felt something unfamiliar. A shift. A crack. Karen was slipping. Her playbook, no matter how well fed, couldn't outrun every safeguard. But it wasn't over. That night, Laura came home to find her porch light unscrewed and a business card stuck under her doormat. No name. No logo. Just an email address and the phrase, "Tell him he's close." Garrett received the same card on his windshield the next morning. They didn't need to talk to know what it meant. The people behind Karen weren't just experimenting with control. They were watching the watchers. The card was still in Garrett's coat pocket 2 days later when he walked into the administrative substation under the guise of returning equipment. He didn't mention the message to anyone, didn't report it through the official chain, and certainly didn't include it in the city's secure incident portal. He simply held on to it, as if by keeping it close he could control the implications. Across the city, Laura did the same. She hadn't responded to the email listed, hadn't mentioned the light bulb or the deliberate placement of the card beneath the doormat, but her routines had shifted. She now left her porch light on during the day and kept her front window cracked open just enough to hear gravel if it shifted under a footstep. It wasn't fear that gripped them. It was calculation. Whoever had delivered those cards wanted to be noticed but not confronted. That level of measured subtlety suggested structure, intelligence, not randomness. And it meant one thing above all. They were not dealing with a rogue resident anymore. Karen had been the bait, perhaps even a believer in her own cause, but the hand that moved her was operating well beyond the reach of neighborhood disputes. The realization, though inevitable, reshaped their understanding of the game. Garrett spent that week tracing infrastructure permits. What he found was an oddity too specific to ignore. At least 7 residential blocks within city limits had received unusual utility review notices within the last 90 days. Each cited traffic flow improvement as the rationale, but none of the areas were near major roads or intersections. More telling, all 7 blocks had active complaints filed by individual residents with eerily similar language, concerns about external vehicles, unfamiliar faces, parked trailers, or unspecified property line stress. And in 5 of those 7 cases, the person filing the complaint lived in a house that had been refinanced in the past 2 years under obscure, rapidly fluctuating mortgage brokers. The names of the lenders barely appeared in city systems, but every loan was processed by a title office tied back to a corporate entity called Lindell Services, which on paper handled everything from document storage to property surveys. Garrett ran Lindell through every system he had access to. Nothing showed up in local enforcement. No citations, no tax issues, no vendor disputes. They were clean, too clean. Meanwhile, Laura took a different route. Through a quiet contact at zoning, she obtained access to archived land use requests dating back 5 years. What she found startled her. One parcel in particular, a small lot located just outside Karen's block, had been flagged 3 times for early review of parcel splitting, the process by which large residential lots are subdivided and resold. All 3 requests had been initiated under different names, all rejected due to lack of public access compliance. But in the footnotes of the 3rd denial, someone had appended a recommendation. Consider traffic buffer provision under Citizen-Initiated Adjustment Framework. That clause didn't exist in any municipal handbook. Laura checked twice. It was fabricated, slipped into a real document, buried in language dense enough to go unnoticed. The implication was immediate. Someone was testing how far unverified language could be pushed into formal systems, seeing if city infrastructure could be steered from within, using policy mimicry. The next morning, Garrett met Laura at a quiet public garden outside district jurisdiction. It was early, cold, and empty. They walked without speaking, until Garrett handed her a folded printout. Property transfer listings over the last 18 months filtered through a narrowed set of lender codes. The pattern was undeniable. Multiple addresses tied to the same 3 firms. Short-term refinancing, followed by aggressive civic complaints, neighborhood disruption, and eventual silence. And all of it happened with plausible paperwork. No violations, no lawsuits, no obvious fraud. Just enough irregularity to confuse, not convict. "So what are they doing?" Laura asked finally. "Incremental land control," Garrett answered. "Quiet displacement. Use civic panic to devalue, push owners out, isolate the parcel, then flip it after minor adjustments. But the part that makes it dangerous, they're co-opting municipal structure to make it look self-regulated," she finished. Garrett nodded. The towing, the fake signs, the unverified soil reports, each one seems small, but together they build an artificial framework. A parallel enforcement track, using city forms, city language, but none of the oversight. Laura was silent for a long moment. Then she asked, "What happens when someone refuses to move?" Garrett looked out over the garden, his voice low. "They get tired, they get cited, they get trespassed, and if that doesn't work, they get erased administratively," she finished again. That evening, Garrett found a printed packet left in his mailbox at home. No postage, no envelope. Just pages stapled cleanly, formatted like an internal summary. The title read, "Upcoming Candidate Sites, Phase B." Scanned documents followed, maps, lots, annotations. At the bottom of the last page, a single line highlighted in yellow. "Melrose site already activated. Observe responses closely. Adjust tone if legal pushback escalates." It wasn't a warning. It was an instruction, meant for someone inside the machine. And now Garrett had it, which meant someone wanted him to. The middle of the board had cracked. It was no longer about Karen, it was about leverage, and someone had just handed them proof that the game was real. The next phase of escalation didn't begin with a dramatic confrontation or a triggered alarm, but rather with a silence so calculated and deliberate that it created a tension more suffocating than any open conflict. For the first time in 3 weeks, no new complaints were filed from Karen's address. No tow requests, no modified forms, no claims of civic violations. The absence of activity was, in itself, an anomaly. Laura noticed it first. She logged into the complaint portal on a Tuesday morning out of habit and found her monitoring dashboard clean. No red flags, no pending filings, not even inquiries. It was like a radio going dead in the middle of a hostage negotiation, a pause that didn't suggest resolution, but recalibration. Garrett noticed it too. His contacts at Municipal Logistics confirmed that Karen's name had been removed from several automated distribution lists. Her permit subscriptions had been paused. The form routing system no longer tagged her residence for high-frequency review. Someone had gone into the back end and dampened all her administrative visibility. She wasn't deactivated. She was being protected. The move was surgical, technical, and likely internal. Laura drove past Karen's block that evening, and what she saw unsettled her. The property looked untouched, but wrong. Windows blacked out with temporary coverings, no porch lights, and a new camera installed on the gutter line. The yard hadn't been touched in days. It was as though the house had become an observation post, no longer a residence. She didn't stop. Just slowed long enough to see what she needed, and then turned back into traffic. When she called Garrett later that night, she didn't ask if he'd seen it. She just said, "They're repositioning." He agreed. "She's not the asset anymore. She's the liability. They're moving the operation behind her, probably preparing to replace her name in the system with something more stable." Laura thought for a moment. "Or," she said, "they already have." The confirmation came 2 days later when a new complaint surfaced on the same block, this time from a name that hadn't appeared in the system before. A woman named Dana Kessler filed a formal obstruction notice against a city maintenance vehicle temporarily parked near a public storm drain. The language was clinical, impersonal, and eerily familiar. She cited traffic safety, buffer zoning, and unauthorized utility presence. The file included an attached form, identical in format to the forged order Karen had used weeks earlier. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a handoff. Garrett's contacts traced the name. No prior complaints. No permit history. But Dana Kessler had recently acquired the property across from Karen's under a quick claim transfer. The deed had been updated just a month earlier, and the paperwork filed through the same title office used by Lindell Services. The signature on the notarization was the same. Laura reviewed the entire complaint history of the property and found a blank slate, until now. It had been a dormant residence, occupied by an elderly couple for nearly 20 years. Then, without formal listing, it was transferred and occupied in less than 5 business days. The house had a new mailbox, a new surveillance system, and a new resident who behaved like she lived there for years. Something about that triggered Laura's instinct. She dug into zoning records and found that the new property had filed for perimeter landscaping upgrades. Minor on the surface, but the plans included a request to move 2 existing boundary markers 3 feet inward toward the adjacent public walkway. It was phrased as access accommodation for municipal vehicle clearance. If approved, it would subtly shift the public access line away from the curb and into public infrastructure space. It would also render future parking on that segment of the street technically in violation. When she showed the documents to Garrett, he didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he pointed to a tiny stamp on the lower right-hand corner of the form. "Look at that seal," he said. "It's the same digital ID number from the Melrose application, but they've changed the emblem. It's now labeled under Urban Integration Group instead of Neighborhood Planning Council. Different name, same number." Laura nodded. "So, it's a shell network. They just rotate names and logos, reusing the back end to deploy new identities. And because the surface details change, the city's filters don't catch them. There's no duplication warning, no fraud flag. It's too decentralized." It was at that moment that Garrett made a decision. He wouldn't go through internal escalation again. He wouldn't file a complaint, wouldn't draft a report. He would document everything on a clean slate, build a closed system of evidentiary review, and when the moment came, drop the entire framework into the public record in a single, irrevocable burst. But he needed one more piece. Testimony from inside. Not Karen, not Dana, someone who had seen the back end, someone who had transmitted one of those forged documents or approved one of those shadow permits. Laura found the name first. A temp admin who had worked 6 months at the emergency planning department under a municipal apprenticeship. Her name was Joanna Bell, and she had disappeared from the city registry after a clerical error terminated her email access. On paper, she had moved out of state, but her last known login had come from a cafe 3 blocks from the Civic Center. Garrett tracked her through informal channels and finally located her in a warehouse-turned-apartment compound on the industrial fringe of the city. When he knocked on the door, she didn't answer, but she called his number 3 hours later. "I don't want to be involved," she said immediately. "They said it was just data sorting. They said I was helping optimize response patterns. Then I saw my login attached to zoning approvals I never reviewed." Garrett didn't push. He just asked one question. Was Karen Melrose's address on any of them? A long pause. Then, yes, but she wasn't the only one. There were dozens. Some of the names were fake. Some were real people, but they had no idea forms were being filed in their name. "Can you send me proof?" Another pause. "If I do, I disappear for good." He understood. They ended the call. 12 hours later, a flash drive arrived by courier to Laura's address. No sender, no return label. Inside were dozens of zipped PDFs, routing records and internal correspondence logs, forms cross-referenced with residential addresses, timestamps, and digital fingerprints showing how back-end authorizations had been spoofed using dormant accounts, and administrative privileges repurposed through modular overlays. It was the map they had been looking for. But just as they prepared to organize and secure the material, the system responded. Laura received a notice of suspension pending administrative investigation, citing unauthorized data handling and breach of procedural discretion. Garrett's patrol rotation was frozen under emergency personnel reassignment guidelines, an unprecedented move for someone without a disciplinary record. Their system's access was revoked, their credentials locked, their emails rerouted. No explanation, no contact, just silence. And then Karen reappeared. It happened at dusk. She was seen standing at the edge of her property, watering a flower bed that hadn't existed the day before. Neighbors reported that she looked refreshed, like she'd been on vacation. When asked about her recent absence, she smiled and said she'd simply taken time to reset. There was no trace of the camera, no cones on the sidewalk, no documents on her porch. But when one resident asked about the construction permit sign that had gone missing, she laughed and said, "Oh, that was just a misunderstanding." Everything's been resolved. The next day, Dana Kessler filed a formal protest against Laura and Garrett by name, accusing them of harassment, intimidation, and unlawful targeting of private citizens. The complaint was broadcast to 3 civic committees and a local oversight board. Within 48 hours, Garrett received a cease and desist notice from City Council warning against continued investigation into sensitive administrative activity. Laura's phone line was disconnected from internal servers, but they weren't done. Together, without authorization, they began compiling everything into a private dossier. Every name, every transfer, every shadow complaint. The flash drive's contents were printed, cross-referenced, and physically stored off-site. If the system wanted silence, it would have to bury the truth beneath concrete, because digital erasure wasn't going to be enough. And as the sun set behind the city skyline that Friday, Laura sat in her car across from Karen's house, watching as the porch light flicked on and the shadow inside stood motionless behind the curtain. She didn't wave. She didn't blink. Because now they weren't playing defense anymore. Now they were waiting to strike. The city was waking up under a blanket of manufactured calm, the kind that exists when something enormous is being carefully tucked just out of sight. Official channels had gone quiet, but off the record, murmurs were surfacing about suspended employees, about audits that never reached the council, about zoning files that had vanished from servers without so much as a trace. Garrett and Laura, now formally removed from any municipal activity, found themselves on the outer edge of a system that had begun closing ranks against its own. And yet, the silence only sharpened their intent. What they now held wasn't just a collection of irregular forms or name swaps. It was proof of a tactical blueprint, a methodical rewrite of civic infrastructure that bent legality without technically breaking it. It wasn't fraud in the classic sense. It was worse. It was administrative mimicry, and it had become invisible by design. They met at a printing center in an industrial park where Garrett had arranged to rent a back room for one night. There, they began assembling the final version of what they had started calling, without irony, the real file. It included every permit crossmatch, every complaint paired with property transfers, every shadow entity that had shifted identities across departments. But most damning of all was the access log, a list of municipal staff IDs used to validate forged authorizations. Some of those IDs belonged to people who had died, retired, or relocated. Others were still active employees, most likely unaware their credentials had been co-opted. The presence of those names raised the stakes exponentially. What had begun as a localized abuse of authority now pointed to a deeper vulnerability inside the city's most basic mechanisms. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about control. But even as they compiled the evidence, they knew that exposure wasn't going to be enough. The people behind this system had designed it with fail-safes, with redirect triggers, with technical diversions that could make any whistleblower look like a paranoid saboteur. If they uploaded the file to a public portal, it would be drowned out by legal threats or delayed into obscurity. If they went to a reporter, they risked framing themselves as disgruntled former officials with an axe to grind. The only viable path forward was impact, visible, immediate, and impossible to ignore. That impact came in the form of a planned appearance by city officials at a quarterly public forum scheduled to be held at the newly renovated Hall of Civic Services. It was a standard event designed for optics. Local leaders, city contractors, and planning department heads answering pre-screened questions from neighborhood representatives. Laura knew the format intimately. She had prepared responses for it in years past. Garrett secured 2 guest passes using credentials borrowed from a retired colleague who had no idea his badge had been reprinted with a new expiration date. They wouldn't get past security with hard drives or cameras, but they didn't need to. Their plan was simple. Introduce their presence, verify their identities in front of people with actual decision-making power, and hand-deliver a single hard copy version of the report into the hands of someone whose signature appeared on multiple authorization logs. Someone who, if cornered in a public venue, wouldn't be able to disavow everything at once. They wore plain clothes. Laura carried the envelope beneath a stack of city planning brochures. Garrett kept his hands in his coat pockets, rehearsing the exact phrasing of his introduction, down to the last word. When they entered the forum room, they saw at least 4 faces they recognized. Not friends, not allies, but figures who had at some point signed off on documents tied to the operation. Karen wasn't there. Neither was Dana. But their paperwork was sitting on the table in front of the Director of Strategic Planning, who glanced over a printout as he sipped his water. The opening speaker was halfway through a bland monologue about infrastructure sustainability when Garrett stood and crossed the room. No one noticed at first. Then the moderator paused, and Garrett simply said, loud enough to carry, "Director, I believe your name appears on these." He dropped the envelope on the table and stepped back. Laura didn't flinch. The director, caught off guard, opened the packet in silence, scanning the first page. He recognized the formatting immediately. His expression froze. Then, without a word, he folded the papers back up and whispered something to a nearby staffer. The microphone was still live. The words were faint but audible. "We need to move this to chambers now." The room shifted. What followed was not dramatic. It was mechanical. A quiet instruction to break early, an escort to a private side hall, a brief murmur over the intercom about an internal review. Laura and Garrett were not detained. They were simply moved to a small office lined with chairs and 2 security monitors looping footage of city streets. A legal advisor entered 5 minutes later, face expressionless. "You've triggered a procedural escalation," she said evenly. "We'll need time to review the authenticity of your materials." "They're not just authentic," Laura replied. "They're the blueprint for how your system is being used against itself." Garrett added, "And we have duplicates in 3 separate locations." "This isn't a negotiation." The legal advisor didn't blink. "Then you understand the risks of false attribution." "It's not false if it's traceable," Laura said, and placed on the table a list of 15 municipal ID numbers, each connected to a fake authorization. The room was silent for nearly a full minute. Then the advisor picked up the list and said quietly, "We'll be in touch." They were escorted out the side door. No arrests, no incident. But the shift had begun. Over the next 48 hours, Garrett's old badge was reactivated, without comment or assignment. Laura received a message from her former supervisor requesting a meeting to clarify the scope of prior submissions. Behind closed doors, something was moving. Files began disappearing from public servers. Forms previously marked accessible became locked behind review codes, and 2 of the shadow shell companies quietly dissolved through overnight filings. Karen's address was reassigned to a new owner name, Dana Kessler's house listed for sale. But the most telling change came not through silence but in the appearance of something entirely new. A citywide memo issued under the Office of Structural Compliance announcing a new internal task force to evaluate document authenticity standards across all civic departments. It was a bureaucratic nothing phrase to most, but to Garrett and Laura it was confirmation. They had hit the core, and though they wouldn't be recognized publicly, wouldn't receive applause or even acknowledgments, they had cracked the mimicry. Not by exposing it, but by forcing it to flinch. It didn't end with a verdict, a news broadcast, or a dramatic confession. It ended quietly, as things like this often do when the system corrects itself in shadows rather than light. Garrett returned to work under a nondescript title in Infrastructure Oversight, where he was instructed to review the logistics of traffic pattern reforms that no one really talked about. No ceremony, no reinstatement speech, just a stack of neutral folders and a new email password. Laura declined her offer to return. She didn't need a desk to know the work had been done. Instead, she submitted her resignation and never looked back, her last official act being the careful deletion of non-essential duplicates from the encrypted backups she and Garrett had created, enough to give closure without tempting the system to bury it deeper. Karen Melrose's house changed hands without public listing. The property records showed a full ownership transfer to a private trust with no associated trustee name. One day, she was seen exiting a silver sedan with a rolling suitcase. The next, the windows were boarded, and the lawn was trimmed by a landscaping company that never left an invoice. Her name never resurfaced in city filings. Dana Kessler's house remained empty for months, its utilities disconnected, mail never collected, a "for sale by owner" sign hung at an angle that never shifted. Eventually, someone else moved in, a retired couple from out of state. They never asked questions about the lot's history. The city implemented a new verification protocol for administrative permissions, one that quietly invalidated every ghost authorization Garrett and Laura had traced. No press release, no headline, just a procedural memo tucked into the back pages of the city's legal update bulletin. It stated that all future approvals would require biometric confirmation for ID holders above a certain clearance threshold. The language was dry, the intention surgical. They weren't patching the system. They were burying the exploit beneath stricter layers of silence. Garrett kept the final printed dossier locked in a box inside his garage, not because he thought he'd need it again, but because he knew what it had cost to put it together. He didn't reopen it. He didn't scan the pages or wonder what ifs. He let it sit, inert and unread, like a loaded weapon sealed under glass. Present, but no longer necessary. Laura moved north, somewhere quieter. She bought a house with a wide porch and no shared boundaries. The property lines were exact, the fences old but sturdy. She planted lilacs and rarely used her phone. They spoke once more, months after it all ended, on a call that lasted only long enough for Garrett to say, "It held," and for Laura to respond, "I know." And that was it. There was no need to revisit the past. The city would continue turning as it always had, imperfect and layered with unseen gears, but now just slightly more immune to those who believed they could impersonate authority well enough to become it. Sometimes victory doesn't roar. Sometimes it exhales, and in the stillness that followed, that was enough.